Intro theme. Low rhythmic thrumming of a cello fading into the sound of wind whipping through high-altitude pines. Welcome back to the program. Most people look at a map of Yosemite and see a playground. They see postcards and granite cathedrals. I look at those maps and I see a buffet line. We like to pretend that the lines drawn by the Department of the Interior create some kind of sanctuary. But the dirt doesn't care about federal jurisdiction. The trees don't recognize your permit. There is something deeply, fundamentally wrong with the way people vanish in our high country. It isn't always a fall. It isn't always a bear. Sometimes, the mountain just decides it's finished with you. Tonight we're looking at July 17th, 1981. A bright, shimmering afternoon at the Sunrise High Sierra Camp. 10,000 feet above sea level where the air is thin enough to make your head spin and the silence is heavy enough to crush you. Stacy Arras was 17 years old. She was vibrant. She was athletic. She was the daughter of a high-ranking retired Georgia Air Force Base official. This wasn't a girl who would simply lose her footing and fade into the brush. She was part of a group of 10. They had ridden mules up the steep winding trails to reach this remote cluster of cabins. It was supposed to be a reprieve from the world. But the world has a way of following you into the heights. Sound of a camera shutter clicking. Echoing. The group had just arrived. They were settling in, unpacking the dust of the trail from their clothes. Stacy wanted to take some photographs. She had her camera. She had her youth. She told her father she was going to walk just a little ways up the trail to get a better vantage point of the lake. An elderly man from their group, a man in his 70s, decided to go with her. They walked together for a short distance before he grew tired. The thin air at 10,000 feet is a thief. It steals your breath before you even realize it's gone. He sat down on a rock to catch his breath. He watched Stacy continue up the trail. He saw her clearly. She was maybe 50 yards ahead of him. She stepped behind a small cluster of trees, heading toward a modest ridge that overlooked the water. He waited. 1 minute passed. 5 minutes. The silence of the High Sierra began to settle back in, that ringing stillness that feels like someone is holding their breath right behind your ear. He called her name. Nothing. Just the wind through the lodgepole pines. He stood up, his joints aching, and walked to the spot where he had last seen her. The trail didn't go anywhere else. There were no cliffs to fall from right there. There were no rushing rivers to sweep a 17-year-old girl away in a matter of seconds. When he rounded that cluster of trees, the trail was empty. The ridge was empty. It was as if Stacy Arras had simply dissolved into the golden afternoon light. He looked down at the ground, expecting to see a tripped-over root or a scuff mark in the decomposed granite. Instead, he found something that makes the back of your neck go cold. There, resting on a log, was Stacy's camera lens cap. Think about that. You don't just drop a lens cap and keep walking into the void. You don't take it off and set it down neatly if you're being snatched by a predator. It was placed. Like a period at the end of a sentence. Stacy was gone. And the mountain was suddenly terrifyingly quiet. No screams. No struggle. Just a piece of plastic on a dead log and a girl who had stepped out of time itself. Music swells. Dark, distorted synth notes. Within 1 hour, the High Sierra transitioned from a scenic postcard to a jagged grey. The search didn't start with sirens and spotlights. It started with the frantic, ragged breathing of an old man running back toward the cabins, his boots slipping on the very granite that had just swallowed a girl whole. When Stacy's father heard the news, the world stopped spinning. He was a man of logic, a man of the Air Force. He understood logistics, chain of command, and the physics of the physical world. But physics had just been violated. The search that followed wasn't a standard rescue mission. It was an occupation. Over 150 searchers flooded the area. They brought in bloodhounds. They brought in helicopters that roared through the thin air, their rotors screaming against the silence of the peaks. They combed every inch of that ridge. They looked under every fallen lodgepole and inside every crevice of the granite slabs. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of her clothing. Not even the camera she had been holding. Think about the weight of that. A girl disappears in the time it takes to blink, and she takes everything with her. Except for that lens cap. That piece of plastic marked them. It sat there on that log, centered, deliberate, as if to say, asterisk. This is where the trail ends. The dogs. We have to talk about the dogs. In these cases, the dogs are usually the first to tell you that something is wrong. These weren't backyard mutts, they were elite SAR canines. They were brought to the spot where the lens cap was found. They were given Stacy's scent from her belongings back at the cabin. And what did they do? They paced in circles. They whined. They looked at their handlers with eyes full of a specific kind of mammalian dread. They wouldn't pick up a trail because, according to their noses, there was no trail to pick up. It was as if Stacy Arras had been lifted straight into the ether. Sound of wind howling. Low, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. Then there's the weather. It's a recurring theme in these disappearances, a dark signature that the universe scrawls across the sky. Almost as soon as the search intensified, the heavens opened up. A massive storm rolled over the Sierra crest. Snow. Rain. Fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. It's convenient, isn't it? Just as the searchers are getting close to the ground is washed away. The tracks are erased. The scent is drowned. It's like the mountain was scrubbing the crime scene. Now let's talk about the cynical side of this. The part the National Park Service doesn't want to discuss in their glossy brochures. Stacy's father wasn't just some tourist. As I mentioned, he was a high-ranking official at George Air Force Base. When his daughter went missing, the response should have been transparent. It should have been a matter of public record. But when investigators and researchers years later tried to get the full file on Stacy Arras, they hit a wall. A bureaucratic, stone-cold wall. The Park Service claimed the files were missing or incomplete. When a Freedom of Information Act request was filed, it was denied. Why? Why would a 40-year-old cold case involving a 17-year-old girl be a matter of national security? What are they hiding in those folders? Are they hiding their own incompetence, or are they hiding the fact that they know exactly what's happening in those woods? And they're powerless to stop it. Music shifts. Tense mechanical ticking. Let's look at the geography of the disappearance. 50 yards. That's 150 feet. The distance of a short walk to the mailbox. Stacy was within earshot of the elderly man. If she had tripped, she would have yelled. If a mountain lion had tackled her, there would have been a scream, a struggle, the sound of snapping branches. A mountain lion is a messy killer. It leaves blood. It leaves drag marks. It doesn't neatly remove a lens cap and place it on a log before carrying a 120-pound girl over a ridge without leaving a single drop of DNA. And what about a human predator? In the middle of the High Sierra? To snatch a girl in broad daylight in a window of less than 5 minutes without the elderly man hearing a peep. That's not a kidnapping. That's a magic trick. But in the High Sierra there are no magicians. There's only the granite, the trees, and whatever lives in the spaces between them. The search went on for weeks. They found her father's grief, but they never found his daughter. Eventually, the searchers went home. The helicopters stopped flying. The snow began to fall for the winter, burying the ridge, the trees, and the spot where the lens cap had been. Yosemite moved on. The Park Service filed the paperwork away in a room where the sun doesn't shine. But the locals, the people who live in the shadow of those mountains, they don't forget. They know that Stacy Arras is just one name on a long, dark list. They know that there are places in the wilderness where the rules of reality seem to thin out, where the silence isn't just a lack of noise, but a presence. Sound of a match striking. Long exhale. I think about that lens cap often. Why leave it? Maybe it wasn't a marker. Maybe it was a taunt. Or maybe, just maybe, Stacy knew she was going somewhere she couldn't take it. Maybe she saw something over that ridge that made the camera and the world it belonged to completely irrelevant. We like to think we're at the top of the food chain. We like to think that with our GPS and our satellite phones and our rugged gear, we've conquered the wild. But Stacy Arras is the proof that we're just guests. And sometimes the host decides it's time for you to stay. Forever. Music fades into a low, droning hum. 40 years later, the ridge is still there. The trees have grown a little taller. The granite has weathered a few more storms. And somewhere under the layers of dust and time, the rest of that camera is sitting. Maybe the film is still inside. Maybe it captured the last thing Stacy Arras ever saw. But the mountain isn't giving it back. The mountain doesn't give anything back. Stay off the trails after dark. And if you see something resting on a log that shouldn't be there, don't stop to look. Just keep walking. If you still can. Sound of camera shutter clicks. 3 times. Silence. How does a grown man sitting 50 feet away not hear a single peep? You have to understand the geography of that moment to realize how impossible it is. The air up there is thin and crisp, a natural amplifier for every snapping twig or shifting stone. Gerald Hines was right there, his ears tuned to the quiet mountain afternoon, yet he heard nothing. No scuffle of boots on granite, no intake of breath, no startled cry. That is not a kidnapping in any traditional sense. That is a magic trick, performed by an entity that does not care about the laws of physics. But in the High Sierra, there are no magicians with velvet capes and hidden compartments. There is only the ancient, unyielding granite, the twisted silhouettes of the trees, and whatever predatory thing lives in the hungry spaces between them. The search that followed was a masterclass in frustration and growing dread. They brought in the best of the best teams who knew every inch of Yosemite like the backs of their weathered hands. They found her father's grief heavy and suffocating, but they never found a single shred of his daughter's clothing. The only thing the mountain surrendered was that lens cap. It was sitting on a log perfectly placed, as if it were an offering or a period at the end of a sentence we weren't meant to read. Eventually, the enthusiasm of the searchers curdled into exhaustion, and they went home with their heads hung low. The helicopters stopped their rhythmic thumping against the sky, leaving the silence to reclaim its territory. The snow began to fall for the winter, a white shroud burying the ridge, the trees, and the exact spot where that black plastic circle had been found. Yosemite moved on because the wilderness has no memory for individual tragedy. The Park Service did what they do best when faced with the inexplicable. They filed the paperwork away in a room where the sun doesn't shine, and the dust settles like silt on a dead man's eyes. They labeled it a disappearance, a statistic, a cold case with no leads and no closure. But the locals who live in the permanent shadow of those jagged peaks, they don't forget the way the air feels right before someone vanishes. They know that Stacy Arras is just one name on a long, dark list that stretches back over a century. They know that there are places in the deep wilderness where the rules of reality seem to thin out until they are translucent. Where the silence isn't just a lack of noise, but a heavy breathing presence that watches you from the brush. I think about that lens cap, often turning the image of it over in my mind like a smooth stone. Why would she leave it behind? Maybe it wasn't a marker left by a girl trying to find her way home. Maybe it was a taunt from whatever took her, a calling card left for the searchers to find. Or maybe, just maybe, Stacy knew in that final second that she was going somewhere she couldn't take the world with her. Maybe she saw something over that ridge. Something so vast and terrifying that the camera and the entire civilization it belonged to became completely irrelevant. She didn't drop it in a panic. She set it down because she realized she didn't need eyes to see where she was going. We like to tell ourselves that we are at the top of the food chain, the masters of all we survey. We like to think that with our high-tech GPS and our satellite phones and our rugged gear, we've conquered the wild and made it safe. But Stacy Arras is the cold, hard proof that we are nothing more than uninvited guests. We are the visitors, the interloper, the meat walking through a pantry we don't own. And sometimes, the host of that pantry decides it's time for you to stay. Not for dinner, but as the main course. Forever. The mountain is a patient predator, and it has all the time in the world to wait for us to make one tiny, fatal mistake. 40 years later, the ridge is still there, indifferent to the passage of human time. The trees have grown a little taller, their roots feeding on the secrets buried in the soil. The granite has weathered a few more storms, its surface becoming even more slick and treacherous. And somewhere under layers of dust and decades of pine needles, the rest of that camera is sitting in the dark. Maybe the film is still inside, protected by its metal casing. Maybe it captured the last thing Stacy Arras ever saw, a face or a tear in the sky that would break a sane man's mind. But the mountain isn't giving it back. The mountain doesn't give anything back once it has decided to keep it. Stay off the trails after the sun begins to dip below the horizon. Keep your eyes on the path and don't let your curiosity pull you toward the shadows. And if you see something resting on a log that shouldn't be there, some small piece of a person's life sitting out of place, don't stop to look. Don't reach out to touch it. Just keep walking and don't look back over your shoulder. If you still can. Because once the mountain notices you're looking, it might decide to look back. And that is a gaze you will never escape. This case bears a chilling resemblance to the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the mountains of Colorado. Just like Stacy, Jared vanished in a heartbeat while walking just ahead of a group of adults on a well-defined trail. Years later, his clothing was found thousands of feet up, an impossible incline arranged in a way that defied logic. We also see this pattern in the case of Douglas Legg in the Adirondacks, where a young boy vanished while walking a short distance between two family cabins. The search was one of the largest in the history of the region, involving thousands of people, yet not a single trace was ever found. These cases suggest a terrifying reality where people are plucked from our world in the blink of an eye, leaving behind only questions and the cold, unmoving silence of the woods.